and this is the contents we're going to be looking at. For part 2, we are dealing with perfect and the imperfect markets. And the concepts we are going to be looking at, we're going to be doing the cost calculations. Then we're moving on to the income concepts. We're going to do cost and revenue graphs within a perfect market. We're going to look at profit maximization. And then the last thing we're going to do for today are the characteristics of a monopoly market. Right, so before we get into it, let us first look at some of the core concepts regarding perfect markets. So when you look at, now these concepts are important for your section A of your exam, as well as in the B section, you will always find briefly define or describe, etc. So this is where these things are important. So the first one we're looking at is market structure. Right? What is a market structure? Define a market structure. So a market structure, they are the major organizational features of a market. Right? Then your economic cost, that consists of your, also known as your opportunity cost. And these are equal to the explicit plus the implicit costs. And I'm going to explain now what are explicit and what are implicit costs. So your explicit costs are the actual expenditures of the business. So if you look at your rental, your wages and salaries, all the things businesses have to spend money on, so that's their explicit cost. Whereas your implicit costs, this is the value of the inputs owned by the entrepreneur and used in the production process. So, for example, I could have inherited some money from my grandfather and I can decide to either start a business, or I could have taken that money and invested it into a banking account or something. So that's what we mean by the value of the inputs owned by the entrepreneur. Alternatively, I can choose to use my skills and go and work for someone, or I can take my skills and open up my own business, right? So all of those things, that is where the entrepreneur, his inputs that he's put into the production process. The term perfect competition refers to individual participants cannot influence the price of the product. So when you're working in a market structure where individual people have no power, then that would be an example of perfect competition, right? Specifically when you look at the influence regarding the price of the product. Then the long run. Now you have to be able to distinguish between long run and short run. Yeah, I've just given you the descriptions or the definitions of these concepts, but there is an 8-mark question where you will be asked to distinguish between the long run and the short run. So your long run refers to a situation where all the factors of production and costs are variable, whereas in the short run, prices are influenced through adjustments made to production levels. So in the short run, you have both variable and fixed, okay? Whereas in the long run, everything is a variable. But in the short run, there's always one item that will be a variable. Right, so just once again, when we talk about the long run, please, especially for our accounting students, when in accounting, we speak about long term, where we look at the time frame. For example, the investment is a long-term investment, which means it's an investment for longer than a year. That is what you are taught in accounting. When we speak in economics, we don't speak about, it's not about a time factor here, right? We're speaking about the long run. So the last concept, which is the price taker, that means that the businesses have to take the price that is set by the industry. They have no control over the price of their product, right? The price at which they can sell is set by the industry, and then therefore the businesses are called price takers. Right, we're just going to look at the various cost calculations. Now here we're dealing with fixed and variable costs. So because it's both fixed and variable, you know you're dealing with short run, right? So your fixed costs plus your variable costs is equal to your total cost. And we use the letters FC, which represent fixed costs, and the letters VC, which represent your variable costs. And then total cost is represented by the letters TC. Your average fixed costs, right? So you want to find out what is the average. So you take your total fixed costs divided by the quantity, meaning the number of units that were produced, right? And for average variable costs, you take your variable cost, your total variable cost, divided by the quantity or number of units produced. So AFC, which is your average fixed cost, and AVC stands for your average variable cost. Your ATC, or average total cost, is when we take our total cost and we divide that by the total number of units produced or quantity produced, right? And your average cost or your average total cost, either one of these are interchangeable. It means the same thing. Average cost, AC, or average total cost is the same thing. That is made up of your average fixed cost plus your average variable cost. And then the last cost that we deal with is marginal cost. And how would you define marginal cost? This is the cost of the last unit produced. So therefore, to calculate the marginal cost, it is the change in total cost over the change in quantity. Remember, your average cost is total cost divided by quantity, but your marginal cost, it is the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity. So just very quickly, these are very important to remember. To calculate total costs, it is fixed costs plus variable costs. And to get to your average total cost, it is the total cost divided by quantity. And to get to your marginal cost, it is the change in total cost over the change in quantity. Those are the three most important ones you need to remember. Right. So exercise 4 asks us to complete the following table. And now, can you see why I say those formulas are important? Because you need to now use those formulas to do this in order to complete this table. So I'm going to give you a few moments to just look at the table and familiarize yourself with the table. And think about it. Right, if you think of the term fixed costs, what does the term fixed costs mean? Fixed means that this total stays the same irrespective of the number of units that are being produced. Because you see there, and when you look at your variable costs, these are costs that varies in accordance to what is being produced. And of course, as we said, your total cost is the sum of these two. Your average cost or average total cost is your total cost divided by your quantity. And your marginal cost is your change in total cost divided by the change in quantity. So if you look at this table, your fixed cost is 50,000. And I've just said to you that fixed cost means the cost remains the same irrespective of the number of units that are produced. So if your fixed cost for producing 0 units is 50,000, that means for producing 1 unit, it is still going to be 50,000. For producing 2 units, it's still going to be 50,000. So you see where I'm going with this. So your 50,000 is the same throughout from 0 right up to 5 units. So you can fill that in with, so you start with this column. So you complete this and they're each going to be 50,000. Then we move on to the variable costs now. Now we said your variable costs, these are costs that vary in accordance with the number of units that are being produced, right? Or the quantity that's being put out there. So if I did not produce anything, that means I'm not going to have any variable cost at all. So that answer there will be 0, right? And then to get to my total cost, it will be fixed cost plus variable cost. So it's going to be my 50,000 plus, 50,000 plus the 0 for variable cost, which will then give me my total cost, which will then also be 50,000. So when we move on to our average here, we said average, it is total cost divided by quantity. So you're dividing by 0, you're not going to be able to do that. And there's nothing that goes before, so you can't calculate the marginal cost either. We move to the next line. Remember we said this is 50,000 plus the 60,000 is going to give you a total cost of 110,000. So you take that 110,000 divided by 1 to get to your average cost. So that is going to remain 110,000. Now bearing in mind that average cost there, we didn't have that. So the change in total cost, we went from 50 to 110. So the change in total cost was 60,000. And that 60,000 was the variable cost which was added on. So if your change in total cost is 60,000, what is the change in quantity? You went from 0 to 1. So the change in quantity is also 1. So you got 100, your change is 60 divided by 1. So your marginal cost will also be 60,000. Right, let's just go have a look at the table. Right, there I've completed that table. So you see there, 0, because we didn't produce anything. So 50 plus 0 is 50,000. Those cannot be calculated. Right, like I said, all of these are 50. So 50 plus 60,000 gave me 110. Right, so your average cost is 110. Which is your total cost divided by 1. So your average cost is 110,000. And your marginal cost, which is the change in total cost, so it went from 50 to 110, the change is 60, and divide by 1 gives you 60,000. Then in the next one, all we had was the total cost. But we know that the fixed cost is 50. So we went 158,000 minus, can you see how I'm manipulating the formula now? So it's 158,000 minus the 50,000 of the fixed cost, which then gave me my variable cost of 108,000. And then we said 158,000, which is the total cost, divided by the number of units, which is 2. So it is total cost divided by quantity, gave me 79,000 for the average cost. Now to calculate the marginal cost, it is the change in total cost. So I go 158,000 minus the 110,000 gives me 48,000, and you will notice that your change in quantity has been 1 every time. So it's going to be that change divided by 1 every time. So 48 divided by 1 stays 48,000. This is going to be calculated in exactly the same way. So it's 194,000 for total cost. Okay. So we see there, so 194 minus 50 gives you 144, and then you take that 194 divided by 3 you gave us 64,667. And then here we had the marginal cost of 48,000. That's all that was given. But we knew that this is 50,000 here. So if that is 48, then it means the change here had to be 48. Okay, so I went 194 plus 48 gave me the 242,000, which I then said minus the 50,000, which gave me the 192,000, and then we took 242,000 divided by 4, gave us the 60,500. And then the last one, where you were only given the average cost, so you go 58,400. So to get to average cost, it is total cost divided by quantity. So we only have the quantity. So it's x over 5 gave me that. So therefore I went 58,400 times 5 gave me 292,000, which I then said minus 50 gave me 242. And the change there is 50,000 divided by 1, which is my marginal cost of 50,000. Now please, grade 11s, you do not need 20 different tables in order to practice how to manipulate the formula and how to do the calculations. You can take the same table and just practice it 20 times over until you get it and understand it. Right, we're moving on to the revenue calculations. And this you normally find in the long run. Because remember, in the long run, everything's a variable. So your total revenue, which consists of your price times quantity, which is P times Q. And then your average revenue, the same like you do for average cost. You take your total revenue divided by quantity. And marginal revenue, marginal cost was the cost of making the last unit, whereas marginal revenue is the income earned from selling the last unit. So here you look at the change in total revenue over the change in quantity to calculate marginal revenue. And it is important, please note, that in a perfect market, marginal revenue of a product is equal to the price of a product. Right, the cost and revenue curves. Please bear in mind when drawing the average cost and marginal cost curves, MC cuts AC where AC is at its lowest. So what you must bear in mind that when you are drawing these, when you are asked to draw the average cost and the marginal cost curves, remember we always start with our axes, and you can have your cost, revenue, right, and your quantity and the place of origin. So your AC curve has this shape. Okay, that represents your AC curve. And when you do your marginal cost curve, you must ensure that it cuts AC where AC is at its lowest. So you always first draw your AC curve, find your lowest point, and then make sure that your MC, your marginal cost curve, passes or meets the AC at that lowest point. Okay, so a nice question here could be, what is the relationship between marginal cost and average cost, right? And we will have a look at that a bit later on. Right, graphs under the perfect market. One of the characteristics of a perfect market states that prices are set by the market forces. And our market forces, we're talking about demand and supply. The seller in a perfect market is therefore a price taker. Price takers emerge in a perfectly competitive market because all companies sell an identical product. There are a large number of sellers and buyers. Buyers can access information regarding the price charged by other companies, and there are no entry or exit barriers. And an example of a perfectly competitive market is the agricultural market. Right, so if we just look at the characteristics very quickly of your perfect market, right? So, the goods are homogeneous. What do we mean when we say the goods are homogeneous? They are all identical. So if you look at a bushel produced by one farmer is essentially identical to the bushel produced by another farmer. Therefore, there is no brand loyalty. The goods are exactly the same physically, right? The physical attributes of the goods are exactly the same. So therefore, they are known as homogeneous products. Number 2, there are a large number of buyers and sellers. So there are a large number of sellers such that none of them is able to influence the market price. A farmer cannot deviate. Okay, the word deviate means to move away from. A farmer cannot deviate from the market price of a product without running the risk of losing significant revenue. So to just put this in plain, simple language, what it means is that as the seller within this market, you are compelled to take the price that the industry has set or that the market has set. You cannot change that price. If you do, you run the risk of losing income, right? You will, if you deviate from the market price, then you'll run the risk of losing significant revenue, meaning your loss of income will happen. Number 3, buyers can access perfect information. This means that buyers can easily obtain price information and therefore would seek out the lowest price. Ease of entry and exit. Although agricultural production offers some barriers to entry, it is not difficult to enter the market. Okay? So this is just a few of the characteristics that we find within a perfect market. But these are the characteristics which we want to highlight why these businesses are price takers, why a business operating in a perfect market is a price taker. So to reiterate, in a perfectly competitive market, the market determines the price. Right, NB, you all know what NB stands for, notabene means it's important. In a perfect market, a distinction is made between the industry and the individual business. When costs and revenue curves are drawn, the graphs are drawn alongside one another. So here we've shown you this is what the industry graph looks like, and that is what the graph of the single business looks like. Okay, so this is a business within the perfect market. You have an industry graph which represents, so if you look at your industry graph, it has the demand and supply. So this is the total demand, or this demand curve represents all the suppliers in the market, right? All the producers in the market. The supply curve represents all the suppliers or the producers, and then your demand curve represents all the consumers within the market. Okay, and then your single business look as a horizontal demand curve, right? Not a normal demand curve. And we just heard now earlier on in part 1, when the demand curve is horizontal, that curve is said to be perfectly elastic. Right, that brings us to activity 5. And activity 5 says, with the aid of graphs, briefly explain how price is determined for an individual producer in a perfect market. Okay, now I need you to just look here for a moment. We're going to look at how you will answer this kind of question. They've asked you how to draw the graphs to show how the prices are set for an individual business in the perfect market. So in order to answer that question, you've got to bear this rule in mind, that the graphs have to be drawn alongside one another. So you have to have the one graph there and the other graph next to it, right? That is what we mean by alongside one another. They are drawn next to each other. So you have your price and you have your quantity. And you're starting, and the same on this side. And please do not forget to label your graphs, right? So this one here would represent the industry, right? And this one here would be the individual business. So my industry has all the suppliers and all the consumers, right? And we said that prices are set where demand meets supply. So that point there, which is known as the equilibrium point, is where the price will be set. And that is now the price. So that would be my quantity, and that would be the price. So let's call it P1. So that is the price that the business has to take. So I go and in line with that, so that's where my business has to set its price. So you see there I have my horizontal demand curve, and this is my demand curve, but it's also going to represent the average revenue, and it will also represent the marginal revenue. Because remember, I have to sell at this price. I've got no control over the price, so my average revenue will be the same and my marginal revenue would be the same. The only thing a business controls is the amount of the output. And this, let's say this is an 8-mark question. These two graphs will be 4 marks, and then the other 4 marks will be for your discussion or your explanation. Now, for your explanation or discussion, you're going to write exactly what you've just drawn. You will say to the marker, at point E, which represents market equilibrium, that is where the price will be set. Right? Because remember, we said prices are set by the market forces, which is the demand and supply. So at point E, you have P1 is the price level. That is the price which the individual business has to take, because this is the price that was set by the market. So therefore, your price, your demand curve is horizontal. So that means it's a perfectly elastic demand curve, and this will then also be your average revenue as well as your marginal revenue curve. Right, so if you look here, the market forces of demand and supply determines the price. The sellers are too insignificant to influence the market price, hence they are price takers. Each individual producer is forced to sell his goods at market price. Thus, the demand curve is flat or horizontal or perfectly elastic. It doesn't matter how you want to say this, right? So the individual producer will not increase his price. You don't have to say all of that even, okay? So what you need to understand is that for your 2 graphs, you're going to get a total of 4 marks, and you will be given 4 marks for your discussion. But please note, you do not have to use these words. You can say it in your own words. Right, activity 6. The question is, with the aid of a well-labeled graph, explain shutdown point for the individual firm in a perfect market. You've got to explain shutdown point. Now, I just have to warn you, grade 11s, when we speak about a shutdown point, it does not mean that the business is closing down. Several times, that's one of the options that they have. It doesn't have to be that. So be careful when answering this question. Don't always talk about the shutdown point being the point where businesses close down. Your shutdown point happens, or that is when the business reaches a point where certain decisions need to be made. They need to look at what can they do in order to remain profitable. Because remember, within a perfect market, the lowest income that a business needs to earn is normal profit. So in order to make sure that they can stay afloat, they've got to now make decisions. Because normally what happens is you reach a point where the business isn't profitable, or it might not be the entire business. Let's say I'm making handbags and shoes. So I find my handbag range is not a profitable range at all. It's losing me money. So what do? I just stop producing handbags. So you close down that section of the business. So you see, it's not the entire business shutting down. It's maybe just a section of the business shutting down, right? Or you have to decide, I need to bring in more people, I need some more investment into the business. But shut down doesn't mean the business closes down. However, what I do need you to remember when dealing with a shutdown point, so we're looking at the individual business, so I need to draw the graph for an individual business now in order to discuss the shutdown point. So that we said. Now, to remember the name of this curve, I remember Mr. DARP. So Mr. D, A, R, and P. I remember Mr. DARP, right? So, and then I draw my AC curve, and I draw my MC curve. Right, and if I put another, that is your AVC. And where the AVC meets MC, that there is what we call the shutdown point. Okay, so what has happened in this situation here is, if I just go back quickly here, so what happened was, that was the original price level, but what happened, maybe more suppliers now entered the market, right? So supply increased. So as a result of them being more suppliers in the market, my equilibrium has changed. So it's moved down. Okay, so now I have a new equilibrium, which means my business also had to take the new price, which now dropped to P2. So just to get that understanding, so let's just name this also P1 and P2, the same as that side. So do you understand now? The reason we've got this lowered price level is as a result of the extra suppliers entering the market. So what's happening here now is that's where my AC curve is, right? But this is where my revenue is. So you can see my AC is higher than my revenue, meaning I'm spending more money than what I am receiving. So if I spend more than what I get in, it means I'm making a loss. So a business cannot run at a loss indefinitely. So therefore we have to make a decision. So where your average variable cost curve meets your MC curve, that is known as your shutdown point. This is now where we need to make those decisions. So now we say, at price level P2, the business is only able to cover its average variable costs. But what did we say in the beginning? To get to my AC, it is AVC plus AFC. My average variable cost plus, it's AVC, average variable cost, plus average fixed cost is equal to your total average cost. Okay, so what we're saying is they can pay their average variable costs, but they are unable to pay their average fixed costs. And remember, what did we say? Fixed cost has to be paid irrespective of the number of units produced. So therefore, that is then the shutdown point, right? So your shutdown point, I'll put it here, shutdown point is where MC is equal to a VC. That represents your shutdown point, right? Because we cannot sustain that level of income with those costs up there. So we need to make a decision. We're either going to try and reduce those costs by, like I said, you either get rid of producing a certain thing, or we could decide, I'm sure you heard of the term short time, where people speak about, oh, we're on short time, right? Where the boss, now instead of working a full week, we are working only a couple of days a week, because in that way also a business is able to lower their costs. Okay, so let's just see what it says here. It is important that a firm's revenue covers its average variable cost or variable costs to stay in business. The lowest level of production is 100. So if you look here on the graph, on this particular graph that is drawn for you here, so at 100, right, that is their shutdown point. Okay, the firm will not produce at prices lower than 40 Rand, right? They cannot produce lower than that because AR is less than your average costs. Okay, so you can use either explanation for that answer there. Right, activity 7. Here they say, with the aid of 3 separate graphs, explain the following short-term equilibrium positions in a perfect market. And they want you to explain economic profit, economic loss, as well as normal profit. So we're going to look at the first one now. And the first one is economic profit. Now, in order to calculate profits, we look at our income minus our expenses. Isn't that so? So you look at your revenue minus your costs to calculate your profit. So in order to make a profit, it means my revenue has to always be bigger than my costs. So for economic profit, we need our marginal revenue to be greater than our average costs. So that would now show a profit. So we'll put numbers. We call that 10. And marginal revenue, average revenue, demand. Right. So it says my marginal revenue must be greater than AC. So when I draw my AC curve, I've got to ensure that the AC curve lies below the marginal revenue curve. Okay? So I make sure my AC curve is below the marginal revenue curve. And then draw my MC. And that point here, that's your equilibrium point. Okay? So let's say this is 6 units. And now we must draw. So there's where AC meets that quantity line. I start at that point there and I go across, and that now represents my cost. So let's call that 8. Okay. So there I've now drawn my economic profit graph, because the question says with the aid of a graph. So here I've drawn my graph, and it says a maximum of 10 marks. So this can be anything from 4 to 6 marks, but let's work on 4 marks here, okay? So you'll be given a mark there, and a mark there, and a mark for labeling, full label of the curve, okay? So that's 1, 2, 3, and then for showing your profit area can be another mark, right? So how do I know that this is a profit? So I can explain this. So there are 6 units being produced, right? So the revenue, or the income earned, right? The revenue is going to be the 10 rand times the 6 units, which is going to be 60 rand. My cost, on the other hand, is the 8 rand times the 6 units, which is going to be 8 times 6 is 48 rand. And my revenue minus my cost gives me 12 rand. So therefore, my profit is equal to 12 rand. Another way in which you could show the profit, you could just say your revenue is 10 rand, your cost is 8 rand, so the profit, 10 minus 8 is 2. That's per unit. Then you take it further and you say that 2 rand times the 6, also going to give you an answer of 12 rand. And there you've now explained what the economic profit is. So economic profit exists when marginal revenue is greater than AC. I tell myself this so that when I draw my graph, I know when I draw my AC curve, it must be below the marginal revenue curve. Okay? And then where my quantity line meets my AC, I draw it across to get my cost per unit. And then I can use this as explanation for the graph. You don't have to have lots of words that you're explaining it in. You just need to make it clear to the person marking this so that they can understand what is being done there. Right, so if you look at this answer here, your economic profit, there they've shown you how they've indicated the 4 marks, right? And obviously this mark here for your MCAC, if your MC curve does not cut AC at its minimum, you're not going to get that mark, right? And then you see here, they also give you the explanation of the total revenue is equal to the economic profit is represented by. So you don't have to write all those words. You can just show the calculation and explain how you calculated the profit. Okay. Now, the second part of the question, they asked us the economic loss. They asked us to show the economic loss. Once again, they asked for 3 separate graphs. So we're going to draw a graph once again. And this time, this is now 7.2, and this is going to be economic loss. Now, if we just go back to what we've just said with profit here, we said MR is greater than AC, okay? Or actually we should say AR, not MR, AR, sorry. So in this case, AR is greater than AC. So if you're talking an economic loss, then you're going to have AR is less than AC, right? Your average revenue has to be less. So we look again. Quantity, price. And we can leave it at 10 Rand again. Now, we said AC is greater than AR. So this is my AR, MR, D, right? So AC must be greater than AR. So my AC curve must be above my AR. Right, now I need you to be careful. That is your point of equilibrium, right? So you go down from there to there. And we still leave it at 6 units. And then we go from the equilibrium point, you move up to meet the AC. And then you will go across. And let's call that, what shall we call that one? 12 Rand. Okay. So let's look at our calculation this time around. So if we look at our revenue now, it is still 10 Rand times 6, which equals 60 Rand. We look at our cost, it is 12 Rand times 6, which is going to be 72 Rand. So 60 minus the 72 is going to give me a minus 12 Rand. So when it's a minus, then I know I've made a loss. Once again, another way in which you could have done that, your revenue is 10. Your cost is 12. So the difference is minus 2. Minus 2 times 6 is equal to minus 12. The negative tells me that it is a loss that I've calculated here. And very important to indicate that loss area, which will be that area there. Okay? And if you want to, you could use letters. You could say A, B, C, E. And you could say that area is the loss area. Or it's just easier to just color it in. Or you can even write in here the word loss to show that that represents the area of the loss. Right, we look at the answer here. The economic loss. The minimum point of short-term average cost curve, AC, is higher than the market price. That's exactly what we said on our page as well. AC is greater. The business is in equilibrium at point E, where MR equals MC, and the business will produce at quantity Q and market price P. Total revenue is equal to, so they're just giving you the area now. Total revenue is equal to OQ1, right, which is now in there they've got 40 times 10. And total cost is your OC, or the 50 Rand times the 10, which is the 500. So therefore that area there is the loss, which is the 100 Rand. We just use different numbers. And then the last part of the question here says you've got to do the normal profit. That's 7.3. Right. Now, normal profit is going to be where AC is equal to AR now. So now it's equal. So I must make sure that the AC is tangential to the AR. Right. Once again, our revenue is going to be the 10 Rand times 6, which is 60 Rand. But what do we notice now? The cost is also 10 Rand times 6, which is also 60 Rand. So therefore, there's no profit being made. Now, this point is also called, this is also where we say the business is now breaking even. Please note, I said the business is breaking even, because as the owner of the business, I'm still earning my salary or my income from this business. So what it says there is that the business is breaking even, or they're earning a normal profit, and this is the least amount that the business needs to earn in order to stay in the market. Okay? Because don't think about it, oh, but there's no money being made. No, the business isn't making profit, but as the owner of the business, this is still a better investment for me. Remember, in economics, we take into account the implicit costs as well. So if I taken my money and put it elsewhere, I wouldn't get the same amount of income as I am getting from the business now. Remember at the beginning I said I could take my inheritance and just put it into a bank account, or I can invest it into a business. Now, let's say from the business, I'm earning an income of 6,000 Rand a month. I'm not going to get a 6,000 Rand a month interest from the bank account if I put my money into the bank. So therefore, this is what we call a normal profit. It is that point where AC is now equal to AR. Oops, so we just go there to the normal profit. So you see, once again, at point E, they will produce, and the lowest point of AC is tangent to the AR-MR curve, right? So this implies that AC is equal to AR, and there they talk about normal profit is minimum earnings required to prevent entrepreneur from leaving the market. And that is now how we've explained the three profit positions or equilibrium positions within a perfect market. Please, grade 11s, I have to caution you one more time. Very popular Matric essay, okay? Right, we're moving on. Profit maximization. So, as you know, in traditional economics, the goal of a firm is to maximize their profits. They want to try and make the most that they can. This means they want to maximize the difference between their earnings, that is revenue, and their spending, which is the cost. So to find the profit maximizing point, firms look at marginal revenue. Remember, what did we say? What is marginal revenue? It is the total additional revenue from selling one additional unit. And the marginal cost is the total additional cost of producing one additional unit. Okay, so they want to maximize the difference between those two. So when the marginal revenue is greater than the marginal cost, then they are making a profit. This leads directly into the marginal decision rule, which dictates that a given good should continue to be produced if the marginal revenue of one unit is greater than its marginal cost. Therefore, the maximizing solution involves setting marginal revenue equal to marginal costs. So what they're saying is that your profit maximization point is at that point where marginal cost is equal to your marginal revenue. So as we see here, point E represents marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. That is known as the profit maximization point. What that is saying, because even if they, let's say for example, this business is producing, okay, let's use the economic profit graph quickly. Right, so here we said they're producing 6 units, but let's say they produce 5 units. Let's say they produce here at 5 units. What do we notice? Their cost is still 8 Rand, which is 40. Their revenue is 50, so they're still making a profit of 2 Rand. But the where they're making the most profit is when they're selling 6 units, because at 6 units they're making a profit of 12 Rand. Whereas at 5 units, yes, they're still making a profit, but it is a much smaller profit because their revenue is less. They're only getting in 50 Rand now, right? So as opposed to getting in 60 Rand. So therefore, maximum profit is where MC is equal to MR, right? So if you think about it, within a perfect market, we've now looked at profit maximization, is where MC equals MR, and we've looked at shutdown point, MC equals AVC. Can you see MC plays a very huge role? There's always MC involved here, right? And then you also have your market equilibrium, where MC equals D, right? And market equilibrium is always where supply meets demand. So what does that tell us? Our MC represents our supply curve. At least that part of your MC curve represents your supply curve. So please, these are important to remember, right? Profit maximization, MC equals MR. Shutdown point, MC equals AVC. And market equilibrium, MC equals D, which is all at that same point. Okay. Right. So this is relatively straightforward for firms in perfectly competitive markets in which marginal revenue is the same as price. Monopoly production, however, is complicated by the fact that monopolies have demand curves and MR curves that are distinct, causing price to differ from marginal revenue. We're not going to be looking at the graph for the monopoly, but the last section that we are going to have a look at is the characteristics of a monopoly. So we're going to be looking at the characteristics of a monopoly. We won't have time to get into the graphs of the monopoly. So when you look at the characteristics of a monopoly, in a monopoly, there is one producer. So you need to explain this point, right? You can't just write one producer. You need to explain what you mean by that. So if you look at the word mono, mono means one. So there is one producer in the market. So because there is only one business, that means there's no competition. There's nobody he's competing with. Secondly, because he is the only one in the market, he then also is the industry. Not like in a perfect market where you have thousands of sellers, right? So therefore, all these sellers put together then forms the industry supply curve. The monopoly, in a monopoly, there's only one business. So the monopolist is also the market. Okay, so one producer meaning he also forms the market, and there are absolutely no competitors. No near substitutes. Remember what we said earlier on? Substitutes are products that replace one another. In a monopoly market, there are no near substitutes, meaning you cannot find a substitute for that product. And the one example we know, a big example in South Africa, obviously, is Eskom. There are no near substitutes for electricity. So we've got to pay whatever we've got to pay to get that electricity from Eskom. Determine their own production level, right? The monopolists can decide at which level they want to produce. They are not ruled by demand and supply like a perfect market, right? The monopolist can decide, I'm only going to, there's 100 people that want my product, I'm just going to put out 80. Why do you think he's going to do that? Because by doing that, he's creating a false shortage on the market, and when there's a shortage, prices increase. So now he can get more money for his product. Do you understand? So he determines how much he's going to put out there. Supply unique products. The fact that there are no near substitutes makes these products unique. Right. There are barriers to entry. Now, when we talk about barriers to entry, it means it is difficult for others to enter the market, not like in a perfect market where we said there are no entry barriers, right? Everybody's free to enter and exit as they please. With the monopoly market, there are certain barriers. And for example, like I just used Eskom as an example now, but Eskom is what we call a natural monopoly. You see, the kind of investment needed to start an electrical supply business, you need huge amounts of investment for that. So with the result, it just happened that it became a government business and they had to supply it because private people were not interested in investing in this undertaking, because remember, you need large amounts of capital to get started. And secondly, you're going to wait a very long time to see any returns on that investment. And you just need to see the problems Eskom is sitting with. They run at a loss all the time. And the question that arises is, but this is a monopoly. How can they be running at a loss? But remember, they are not a normal business. Remember, they are also being curtailed by government in terms of their pricing and how they handle their non-payment. So they struggle to get people to pay them on time. They can't set the prices as they see fit. They've got to get permission if they want a price increase, right? There's a body that controls that, right? It's one of the prices that are controlled. So do you get the understanding that there are barriers to enter? So one of the barriers in the case of like a company like Eskom, that's a national monopoly, it's normally the startup costs are so high that others can't get into the market. But there are other barriers that also exist, right? Because remember, you can also have what we call a regional monopoly, where you will find that this is the only shop where you can get your groceries and things from. And one thing I've noticed, if you travel around South Africa, you'll find a Spar everywhere. Okay, in the smallest of towns, there's going to be a Spar there. So they sort of have a regional monopoly in that area. And then later on, you will find that other shops also then join and become a competitor to them. I know for years in the Caledon region, Spar was the only place you could really get your things from until Pick n Pay now entered a few years back. But in that case now, that is where there are certain like patents with pharmaceutical companies. They use patents on their medicines. So for the first 10 years, nobody else can now come up with a generic to that medication or whatever, right? Or use some of their things to develop another similar medication to what they've come out. So those things are licensing agreements, patents. These are all things that create barriers to other businesses from entering the market. Right. Price setter, the monopoly is the price setter. Remember, in a perfect market, the prices are set by the industry, but we said in a monopoly market, the business is also the industry, so they determine their own price. They decide what their price will be. And they're very good with what we call market penetration. You know, when they get into the market, they start at the lower price, and once they've got the people on board, then they start increasing the price, because obviously as the demand increases, the prices also then start to increase as well. Makes economic profit, right? So a monopoly is the only market structure where you can make economic profit in the short run as well as in the long run. Right? Because you're the only supplier, you can make sure that you are constantly making enough. Because as I said, what a monopolist will do when they see, oh, we're not making enough, they just scale down the supply. Because by scaling down the supply and creating that shortage, prices will then automatically increase. So they can always maintain their profit position, right? So they can ensure that they make economic profit in both the short run as well as the long run. Because remember, in perfect competition, when you are making economic profit, that economic profit acts as a magnet for others to enter the market, because in perfect competition, the entry is free. Right? There's nothing that's keeping them away. There are no barriers. So as soon as other people see you making money, they also jump on board. And we saw that when the supply increases, the prices decrease, and therefore perfect competitors only make normal profit in the long run, whereas the monopolists can make economic profit in the short as well as the long run. They have full information about the market. Please be careful with this one. It's full information about the market. They are fully aware of the current market conditions. Okay? They don't have perfect information. Like with a perfect market, you have perfect information. You know everything there is to know about the product. You know everything there is to know about the market. Whereas in a monopoly, you don't know everything about the product, because that's another way or another barrier to entry is the technical superiority. So if you don't know the innermost workings of something, then we can still keep you out of the market. So therefore, they have full market knowledge, right? They know everything there is about the market and the market conditions. And that brings us to the end of this presentation. So just to recap very quickly what we have looked at for today, we've looked at elasticity of demand, we've looked at elasticity of supply, we've looked at, price elasticity of demand, price elasticity of supply, income elasticity of demand, as well as cross elasticity of demand. And I hope you still remember what I said to you when it came to the elasticities, that you remember that your graphs for your price elasticity, you your inelastic demand curve looks like a letter I, your elastic demand curve looks like a letter E, and that with your cross elasticity, you're dealing with substitutes and complements. With income elasticity, we're looking at normal and inferior goods, right? And then we went over to section 2 or part 2, which dealt with your perfect markets we looked at first. And one of the first things we looked at is that when you're drawing your AC and your MC curve, to ensure that your MC always cuts your AC where AC is at its minimum. And then we went to look at how the price is set. The industry graph consists of your demand and supply. And where demand and supply meets, that is your market equilibrium, and that is the point at which prices will be set, which the individual business then has to accept, and therefore they are known as a price taker, because they've got to take the price that has been set by the industry, and then that is their demand curve, which is a horizontal demand curve, which means that this demand curve is perfectly elastic. But it's not only the demand curve, it is also the average revenue curve and the marginal revenue curve. And the reason this is a horizontal curve is because they have absolutely no control over the price. They have to take the price as is. We then also looked at the shutdown point. And I said you don't see shutdown as the business closing down, not necessarily closing down, but they're just making some adjustments to their business or how they do business in order to try and decrease those costs, right? And we said the shutdown point is where MC equals your average variable cost. Then we looked at the various profit positions or the equilibrium positions of business in a perfect market, and we said economic profit exists when AR is greater than AC, and therefore when I draw my curves, I've always got to make sure that my AR curve is above my AC curve, or the AC curve is below the AR curve, right, in order to get that. And where my MC meets MR is the equilibrium, and that will be my output. And then we just draw across to get the revenue and costs. Then we moved on to economic loss. And here we said the AR is smaller than AC, or AC is greater than AR. So in this case, the AC curve is now above the AR curve. And that shows the loss. And then we looked at the normal profit that we said where your AC is now equal to AR, so therefore AC is tangential to the AR curve, right? And then we looked at your profit maximization, which we said is where MC equals MR, because any business wants to make maximum profit. That is the idea. Your shutdown point, once again, MC equals AVC, market equilibrium, MC equals D. And then to close off this session, we looked at the various characteristics of the monopoly market. And that's all from me for today. Thank you very much.